Let's get started. Good morning. We're in Revelation 14 today, and we've got to take, of course, it seems like we're always backing up and getting a run at it. And it's really important right now because over the past few weeks, we've been in Revelation 12 and 13. And Revelation 12 and 13 are very, very rich in images and details and symbols and historical significance. And so we spent an awful lot of time on those symbols and that kind of stuff. And the problem is that we can lose sight of the big picture. And like I said from the very beginning, one of the most important things about Revelation is hearing the big picture, seeing what's going on. So I want to back up just a touch, give you the stories. And the good news is that I think from here on out, most of the symbols have been established. A lot of the cultural stuff's established. So we ought to be able to move a little more quickly through the rest of it. So let's, big story. We've been going through, in the book of Revelation, we had been going through a real, just worked a certain way. There was, there's something happens in heaven, and then they're opening seals, and each seal creates something, and they get to a certain point, and then they start blowing trumpets, and each trumpet has a thing. And then in chapter 12 and 13, there's a break, and there's this big event that happens, and there's a woman who is pregnant, and she comes to earth. She's on earth, and she's pregnant, and there's this dragon who's wanting to eat her baby, and she gives birth to the child. The child immediately goes to heaven, and then the dragon tries to chase the woman, but the woman is able to escape into the wilderness, and earth actually helps protect her. And then the dragon then goes to the shore of the ocean and calls forth a beast out of the ocean, and then he calls forth a beast out of the earth, and the beast out of the ocean is a governmental thing, and the beast out of the earth is more of a religious or an economic thing that is in support of the beast, and everybody's worshiping the beast, and there's a real strong distinction. And then today there's going to be some pronouncement in chapter 14 before we get back into the concept of trumpets and seals and bowls, which are coming up next, I do believe. So let's just go through chapter 14. I think we can do all of chapter 14 today. Chapter 14, then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb, standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And of course, two things jump out immediately. The 144,000, we've talked about that. It is such a unique number. There's no way he's changing what he's talking about. We'll see some interesting aspects to it in a second. But 144,000, that is the ultimate number of completion. This is all of the saints forever. This is you, this is me, this is all of us, and this grouping of 144,000 isn't a literal number. John loves symbolic numbers. We talk about that a lot. 144,000, it's been in here numerous times. That's us. That's everybody who's ever been a Christian. Okay, and they have his name and the Father's name written on their foreheads, which of course is in distinction to, that's a good word, is in contrast to the beast, which put his number on their foreheads and his number on their wrists. I did find something interesting to do with that last week, getting the number on your forehead on your wrist, was pointing out that in Deuteronomy chapter 6, one of the signs of being a Jew was writing the scripture on your forehead and on your wrist in a phylactery. And it's possible that symbol was more religious than economic. It was used for economics because all those things were tied together in those days. But it could have just been a phylactery with the name on it and not anything weird at all. And so anyway, let's keep reading. Then I heard a sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters and like a loud peal of thunder. And immediately I think this is going to be God speaking, because we hear things like that in Ezekiel and other places. But I hear the rushing waters, the loud peal of thunder. It was like, it says in the next verse, the sound I heard was like that of harpists playing their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne. It's the 144,000 singing. And it sounds, there's a godlike quality to it. God is speaking through the people who are worshiping him. Okay? They sang a new song before the throne and before the living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. Now, this is where it gets interesting about, okay, that 144,000, because this is some interesting stuff here. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they remain virgins. They follow the Lamb where he goes. They were purchased from among all mankind and offered as first fruits to God and the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths. They are blameless. I thought we just said that they represented all of Christianity, everybody who's ever followed Christ. How can they be virgins? Because most of us aren't. Well, in the Old Testament, and the Hebrew Bible, and even into the New Testament, worshiping an idol was considered adultery. Okay? Matter of fact, we're going to see that in just a second in this chapter, how the people who are worshiping idols are prostitutes. They're prostituting themselves. They're committing adultery. So it's that area, I believe, is what we're talking about there. And it's, in verse 5, if that wasn't enough, verse 5 says, no lie was found in their mouths and they're blameless. Oh, wait a second. I know what's going on. See, that right between there it says, they were purchased from among mankind and offered as first fruits. So we are purchased by God. God purchased us back as first fruits. Okay? And what does God do when he purchases us? He takes Jesus' righteousness and he pours it over us. So when it comes to spiritual things, we're as pure as virgins. No lie has come out of our mouths. We are blameless. Not because we are personally blameless, but because Jesus' work in us has made us completely pure. That's a picture of us as the blameless bride of Christ. We're going to be, matter of fact, that's going to happen in a while. We're going to be the bride of Christ. And now he's talking about how we have been purified because Jesus the Lamb has redeemed us and restored us. And so there's this praise. And what's going on here is this is to encourage us. To say, hey, when things get rough, remember, you are part of the purchased bride of Christ. You are perfect in his sight. You are flawless. You are blameless. You are virginal. You are full of truth. Okay, so it's really cool stuff. And what's happening next is there's this first part of it where it talks about us being made pure. This, of course, reminded me of Romans 8:29. Those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, so he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. We're the first fruits. We're the firstborn. And so we are brought before God. And that first little section was a positive encouragement. Here, you should be thankful, even though you're going through rough times, and you're going to go through rough times. You should be thankful because you're part of the permanent bride of Christ. Now he shifts when we get to the next section, because now it's, you should be thankful, first off, because you're on the right side. You should also be thankful because you're not on the wrong side. Excuse me. And that's what happens here in the next little section in chapter 6. It says, then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. That's everybody. And he's proclaiming this eternal gospel. And he said in a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water. So it's this call. It's kind of like, okay, we've got all the redeemed have been redeemed. Okay? And there's this last call going out. And it sounds like, a last chance for people to accept Christ. But if you just keep reading, verse 8 says, a second angel followed and said, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries. Oh. They're being told the truth, but it's too late. They've already rejected. They're now drunk on the wine of Babylon's adulteries. And Babylon is the power city. It is, in those days, it would be Rome. In our day, if you were to say, what's Babylon? Babylon is the economic center of the world. Right now, it might be considered New York. I don't know if it's a specific city, but that's what's going on. Is there's an announcement, but for the people who have not already accepted Jesus at this point, wherever this occurs, it's too late. The 144,000 have been pulled out, sealed, signed, delivered, and now nothing's left but judgment. And that's verse 9. A third angel followed them and said in a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast in its image and receives its mark on their forehead. See, we heard Jesus put his mark on our forehead, and they have the beast mark on theirs, on their head. They too will drink the wine of God's fury, which has been poured out full strength in the cup of his wrath. And that sounds strange to us, drinking a cup of wrath. But if you go through the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament stuff, you're going to see that's a normal thing, that God takes a cup of his wrath and hands it to people and says, drink this. Jeremiah 51:7 says, Babylon was a gold cup in the Lord's hand. She made the whole earth drunk. The nations drank her wine, therefore they have gone mad. And Isaiah 60 has it. Psalm 75:8 has the concept of the cup of God's wrath, the wine of God's wrath, the undiluted wine of God's wrath. In those days, they normally took wine and diluted it 2-to-1 with water, because they had to drink a lot of it because water wasn't very good. If they wanted to drink straight wine, the only reason you drank straight wine was to get drunk those days. I think it was stronger than what we have, so don't freak out too much, okay? So the gospel's been proclaimed, but it's too late. They're rejecting it because they're drunk on the wine. And then in verse 10, it gets really sad. The end of verse 10, moving forward. They will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb. And of the smoke of their torment will rise forever and ever. There will be no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and its image, or for anyone who receives the mark of its name. This calls for patient endurance on the part of the people of God who keep his commands and remain faithful to Jesus. And this is a reminder, I may touch on it a little bit later. We have a tendency not to want to talk about the concept that there is a negative result for rejecting Jesus. We talk about the positive result. You get a relationship with God, you get an eternity with God. But there is a negative. There is a reverse to that for people who reject God. And it's really important to remember that, because I think most of us, if we're not careful, we have become practical disbelievers in hell. We don't really believe God's going to do anything negative. And what that does is it dilutes our witness. It dilutes the passion we have for reaching people for Christ. We're not as concerned as we should be, because we really, if we took a test, we might write it down. People who don't accept Jesus go to the bad place. They go to hell. They go to Hades. We might write that down. But in our minds, we kind of believe that people who accept Christ go to heaven, and those who reject just cease to exist. There's like a disappearance, or maybe there's another place. And the Bible's really clear about it. I don't like it. I hope I'm wrong about a lot of that stuff. But the Bible seems to be incredibly clear that people who reject Christ have an eternal punishment. And I don't want to have that so that I'm gloating over anybody. I want to remember that so that I'm passionate about reaching people, so that I'm reaching people intentionally, and that I don't forget they have an eternal destiny. And it isn't they win or they, it's not like the lottery. The lottery, you scratch it off, either you win or you didn't. And if you didn't, you throw away the paper and everything's fine. But this is not the case. There is a reward and there is a punishment, and we need to remember that. And it's going to get really strong and powerful in just a little bit longer about that. Park on past. Then I heard a voice in heaven say, "Write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes," the Spirit said, "they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them." Now, this is interesting to me, I hope to you, because whenever it says write this down, see, John is living at this moment a straddle eternity. He has one foot in the future, he has one foot in the past, he's living in the present, but he's everywhere at once. He's seeing things from the distant past, he's seeing things from the immediate present, he's seeing things from the distant future. But he is our emissary, he is our agent. Those of us who hear this book, who listen to this book and read this book. And if I'm not mistaken, and I believe this is what's happening, anytime he's told to write something down, it's like he is to bring this message from the future to us. Okay? He is coming back out and said, when you get back, remember to tell him this. And so what is written down isn't written down to be used in the event that's happening. It's written down to come back and tell us. So when he says, write down, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on, he's saying eternity is settled. Okay, the end has done. We've read the back of the book, we win. God is going to triumph. So therefore, blessed are those who die in Christ. And the implication are those who die for Christ, who are willing to be martyrs. But it also means all of us who are willing to live for Christ, passionately, all out. Blessed are you, because the end has been settled. So he's bringing it back from the future, and he says, hey, I just got back from the future, and I can tell you this is what it looks like. And so you should be blessed. You should be happy. You should rejoice, because the end is settled. That's what that means. Write this down, which means take it back to originally the 7 churches in Asia Minor. Now bring it to us. Bring it to Steve. Tell Susie. Tell everybody that it is settled. And you can be blessed and you can be happy living into that truth and that reality. So that's what's happening right there. Okay? Now, Revelation 14, verse 14 and following, we now get another picture of the judgment. And there's a debate in it. Let me read you the whole thing, and then we'll talk about the discussion, and how I think it to read it. It says, I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold in his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So he was seated on the cloud, swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Then another angel came out of the temple of heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. And then verse 18, still another angel who had charge of the fire came from the altar and called out in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe. The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles, for a distance of 1,600 stadia, which is a long way. And the two questions that you ask when you read it is that talking about one harvest given from two perspectives? Because there's a grain harvest. One angel goes out with a sickle and harvests the grain, and the second angel goes out with another sickle and harvests the grapes and tramples the grapes, and there's wine. There's not much mentioned about that. And the question is, are there two harvests? Are they two separate things? Or are they one? And the second question, who's that dude on the cloud? Okay, that's a big question. That's really an important question, because when I first read it, I say, okay, he's on a white cloud, seated on the cloud. He's like the Son of Man. He's got a crown of gold in his head and a sharp sickle. He sounds like Jesus. Sounds like the Lamb of God. Sounds like Jesus coming to harvest. But there's a couple things people say, well, you notice there's another angel bossing him around? Because the second angel comes out and says, do the harvest, and the first angel does it. And so there's a couple things. Some people wonder if that's Jesus or whether it's just an angel with a real glorified appearance. I have an opinion. I'll share it in just a second, because I think the answer to that question, the question about who is that angel, is that angel Jesus, is answered when we answer the second question: is this one harvest or two? Is it one picture of God passing judgment on the sinners, or is it a picture of God harvesting the righteous, pulling those of us who are followers of Christ out in one harvest, and the second harvest being the harvest of judgment on the grapes? And here's what I spent last night as I'm going through this, going back and forth. One time, so I think there's one harvest. No, there's two. No, not a harvest, two. Then I finally settled for today on the idea that it is two distinct harvests. I think the first harvest, and that makes that first harvester Jesus, because Jesus is a picture of Jesus coming to get his saints, coming to get his bride, coming to get us. We're always given different pictures of who we are, and I think that's what's happening here. This is Jesus coming in that first harvest to take those of us who are his back to heaven. And the reason I think that is because there are a lot of verses in the Bible which talk about using a sickle to harvest grain as being taking the righteous people to heaven. John 44 verse 35, Jesus says, don't you have saying it's still 4 months until harvest? I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields. They're ripe for harvest. Matthew 9:37 says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. There are so many people who need to be harvested, who need to be brought to a relationship with Christ. There's the parable of the wheat and the tares, or the wheat and the weeds, where at the end they harvest the wheat. They take all the righteous out of the world. Okay? And Romans 1:13, Paul's talking about his own ministry. And he says, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you, as well as among the rest of the Gentiles. So there is this image throughout the New Testament, primarily from Jesus, but even from Paul, that when people come to Christ, it's a harvest. It is like a wheat harvest. You use the sickle, you harvest the grain. And that's what's going on here. I think that's what's happening. And if that's the case, then the person on the cloud is Jesus, who's like the Son of Man. And the other angel isn't bossing him, he's saying the time has come, Jesus. Remember, Jesus says, I don't know the time or the date that's God set by his authority. So it might even be that where the angels say, okay, time's up, Jesus, time to get your people. So I think the wheat harvest is the good harvest. It's Jesus coming and getting his people. And then the next thing that happens, which also plays into that, it says there's an angel that comes forth, and he's got a sickle. And verse 18 talks about still another angel. And it says that angel had charge of the fire. He came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle. So this other angel shows up from the altar. Now, what's going on in the altar? We've got to go way back. We've got to go way back into Revelation, because back in Revelation 8, there's a picture of the altar, and the altar of God, and under the altar are the martyrs, the people who've died for Christ, and they are sending up prayers to God for God to seek vengeance, for God to pay back for what was done to them. And there's another thing where it talks about the prayers of the saints are incense going to that altar. Okay? So there is a fire on the altar, and that fire is being fed by the prayers of the saints to ask God to have judgment and for justice to be done for what's been done to the saints. Okay, all that's been done to the saints throughout history. This is not petty vengeance. This is God. There should be justice. I mean, Nero, I've said this before, Nero lit walkways for parties by burning Christians. Okay? Throughout history, there have been martyrs for Christ, and they are crying out from the altar for justice, for God to have justice for what was done to them, for the people who have, at this point, fully and finally rejected Jesus. They're not getting the mercy of God because they've rejected what Jesus did for them on the cross. And now it's time, and this second angel, this whatever number angel we're up to now, comes flying from the altar with the fire from the incense and the coals of the altar, and comes and presents it to the other angel and says, it's time to answer these prayers. It's time for justice. Because justice means that when somebody does something bad, they get penalty for it. Now, for us, actually for everybody, Jesus offers to take the penalty on himself. Jesus pays the penalty for all of us, but we have to accept that. And for people who reject it, like we said, there's the eternal consequence. There is an eternal consequence, and he's saying it is now time to carry that out. So in Joel chapter 3, verse 13, it says, swing the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come trample the grapes, for the winepress is full, and the vats overflow. So great is their wickedness. So here is the thing. All the prayers of the saints throughout history, all the injustice done to Christians, all the evil done in the world in general is now going to be paid back. All people that have not accepted Jesus Christ, have not accepted his forgiveness for all that they've done. It's time for them to reap the consequences of their actions. If you want to say, why is there a hell? Why is there a punishment? Why is there eternal punishment? It's because people refuse to accept what Jesus has done. So in order for there to be justice, somebody has to pay for it. We've seen a lot of that recently. There's so much frustration. The Breonna Taylor thing that's happening the huge issue about that right now. And one of the biggest challenges, and I think people don't realize this as they analyze how people react, is people believe there should be justice. We have an innate awareness and belief that justice is necessary. We think it's right. And Breonna Taylor is killed. There should be justice. The policeman is shot in the leg and almost dies. There should be justice. And if I shouldn't bring this into it, sorry, but a lot of the problem there is we have some laws that are conflicting in our country, so that this is weird. I'll tell you this real quick. I apologize for telling you this real quick, and I'll probably cut it out before I put it in the podcast. But the way our laws are structured, the police are allowed to come right into a house, and the way that our laws are structured, if you're carrying a gun and you're not 100% sure it's a cop, you're allowed to shoot them. But if you shoot them, they're allowed to shoot back. And so you can have a case like that where it is perfect, where you could have ended up with a dead policeman and a dead woman, and nobody had broken a single law, because of the way our laws are structured right now, which is unjust. That's not right. On either side, that's not right. Okay? And there are lots of unjust laws. There are lots of people who get away with it, people who commit a crime, and for whatever reason, for a technicality, there were no witnesses, but they get a better lawyer. There are tons of reasons people get away with really bad things. Well, those need to be paid for. Now, a huge chunk of those things that need to be paid for, Jesus died for on the cross because we accept him. Those of us who are followers of Christ, we have accepted what Jesus did. So all the sins that we commit, get paid for by Jesus. So there's justice. There is justice because the one suffered for the many. But what about the people who reject, who refuse this payment offer? In order for it to be a just universe, there has to be payment. Now, how that plays out exactly, there can be speculation. We can be curious. The Bible refers to that as hell. Hell is where people pay for their unpaid for sins, for their heinous acts. So here it's talking specifically about the heinous acts that were done to believers, but it's the heinous acts that are done to people throughout history that are not paid for before God. And so there has to be a judgment. There has to be the negative judgment because people are rejecting Jesus. That's real. And we need to really believe that because A, it impacts how we act, and B, it impacts how we treat other people. And how we recognize that if they don't accept how Jesus paid for their sins, they have to pay for their sins. That's a sobering thought. But I want to leave you with that as you go into this week, that somebody has to pay for sins. You can either let Jesus do it, or you can do it yourself. And everyone you know has to make that decision. Heavy thought, but have a good week anyway.